What's the deal with Weatherby? Weatherby rifles, Weatherby cartridges. I think there's a lot of lure around Weatherby rifles, Weatherby cartridges. And if you're like part of the old school gun culture aficionados, you probably know all about Weatherby and what makes them different, unique, but not everybody does. And there was a time when you didn't. And for many, getting into like the gun culture 2.0, where everything's a black rifle and a Glock 19, and maybe they want to get into hunting, and they hear this Weatherby. What is that? That's what we're going to talk about today. Weatherby rifles, Weatherby rifle cartridges. What's up with Weatherby? That's what we're talking about today on Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, hunting, ballistics, equipment, the right way, with Almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world, first-hand experience. I'm your host, Michael Milito. Not a normal long bio, real quick, down and dirty. First and foremost, I am a Christian. God is number one in everything that I do. This podcast is no different. Military, combat veteran, 2 branches of the armed forces, urban warfare instructor, private contractor, law enforcement. More germane to today, lifelong hunter, professional big game hunter, and guide. And that's really what Weatherby cartridges are. They're not really in the tactical arena. Not that they couldn't be used for that, they're just not. They're almost exclusively high-end hunting cartridges. So what kind of characterizes these Weatherby cartridges? I guess speed. Speed kind of defines all the Weatherby cartridges. For most standard things, Weatherby is going to sprinkle some more speed on it and make it a Weatherby. Also, they're kind of renowned for, if you're familiar with a typical rifle cartridge, think of it like a bottleneck where it tapers in. Whether it's 40 degrees, 30 degrees, somewhere in there. But Weatherby has a rounded shoulder. That's supposed to have some special attributes, whether that's actually a thing in physics or whether that's just a marketing thing, I don't know. Honestly, how much of that is overplayed and how much of that is a real advantage, but a lot of the Weatherby cartridges are going to have that rounded shoulder. But a big thing is going to be speed. Push that round faster. Like, think of it as like taking a typical round of that caliber and putting it on nitrous. Another big characteristic is very, very flat shooting. Talking about max point blank range. And point blank range doesn't mean really close. Point blank range means whatever my given target is, I can aim somewhere on that target and hit somewhere on that target. Point blank range might be 375 yards. I'm just using that as an example. Depends on you and your zero and your height over bore and all kinds of minutia, humidity. So, but max point blank range, very flat shooting rounds. That pretty much sums up almost all of these except for maybe the really high caliber dangerous game ones. And even those would probably have a pretty high point blank range compared to other ones in their caliber. But really flat shooting, high velocity, high end hunting cartridges. Weatherby. Now I tried to find a list on the Weatherby website of all the Weatherby cartridges. I could not, which seems odd, but I did see some pictures with the Weatherby logo in the background with the cartridges listed. 224, 240, 257, 270, 7mm, 300, 340, 378, 416. And those are all going to be like Weatherby. And there are other cartridges. Those are just the ones, real common ones. There are other Weatherby cartridges. I know there are because I know of them, like the 300, 378. Because the 300 Weatherby wasn't enough for you. Take the 378 and neck it down, right? Just I don't want to say insane, but just pushing the limits of what a rifle and a cartridge can do. That's Weatherby. There's also the 6.5 300, which is just a screaming fast 6.5 millimeter. And they just came out with one that is a little bit different, but still just a good cartridge. It's a 6.5 RPM. Now, thanks to one of the patrons, I have an old Cartridges of the World book. Before that, I was using one of my reloading manuals. But I'm going to use Cartridges of the World for this, just to give you a rough idea. 223 Remington, not because it's the fastest 22, because it's a pretty high velocity 22 round that you're probably familiar with. If we look at a pretty vanilla loading for that, we look at a 55 grain military load, 55 grain FMJ boat tail at 3250. If we look at the 224 Weatherby Magnum, we're looking at a 55 grain, and that's going to be at 3600. 3200 versus 3600. If we look at one of my favorite deer hunting calibers, the 243 Storied, put down many a deer. 243 Winchester. If we look at one of my favorite loadings in there, 85 grain soft point at 3320. That's nothing to sneeze at. That's a high velocity 6 millimeter round. 85 grains at 3320 for just over 2,000 foot-pounds of energy. 2080. If we look at the 240 Weatherby Magnum, we look at an 85 grain at 3450 for 2247. Again, the 243 is already a fast cartridge. You're looking at, what was that, 2080 versus 2247? It's faster, right? It's a Magnum 243. 240 Weatherby Magnum. It's pushing those bullets fast. We look at another great deer round, the 25-06. A lot of people really love that. It's got a really hardcore following. What's a good grain weight to pick for that? Let's just pick 100 grain for nice round numbers. 100 grains at 3,300 for 2419 of energy. So 100 grain at 3,300. Those are some good round numbers. I like that. The 257 Weatherby Magnum, 100 grain at 3,400. Picking up another 100 feet a second. Now, if we look at 30 cal, because we're Americans, right? We love 30 cals. 30 cals are a great all-around, do-it-all, slay any beast in North America kind of round. What's a good 150 grain is a good 30 cal round. It's not the only one, but let's just pick it. You're probably familiar, if you're not, you're probably not listening to this podcast, but you're probably familiar with the 308. Rough numbers, I like to say 150 at 28 something. But for this reloading manual, right on the money. First one to list, 150 grain at 2800. If we look at the Weatherby with 150 grain bullet, we're looking at the 300 Weatherby Mag, 150 grain at 3,300 feet a second. That's 500 feet per second faster with the same grain weight bullet. If we look at the energy for the 308, we're looking at 2612. If we look at the energy for that load in the Weatherby, it's 3628. Right? Just screaming out of that barrel. And you might say that's not fair because you're comparing a standard 30 cal to a Magnum. Okay, well, if we look at the 300 Winchester Magnum, which is like the most common 300 Magnum even today with all the other things trying to supplant it, it also lists a 150 at 3,300 feet a second. So you might think, well, what's the point? But wait, there's more. There is, if the 300 Weatherby Magnum wasn't enough, there is an even faster 30 caliber Weatherby. The 3378 Weatherby. This doesn't even bother in this reloading manual. It's a little piddly 150 grains. This starts off with 180 grain Barnes X, which is just a phenomenal bullet, at 3283. If we compare that to 180 grain in the 300 Winchester Magnum, you're looking at 3,000. Over 200 feet per second more. Actually, almost 300 feet per second more because it's 3283. And it does list 165 grain ballistic tip at 3,500 feet a second. If you remember, when we started out talking about the 223, that's faster than a 55 grain 223, and you're talking 165 grain. Let me say that again. A 223 military load right around 55 grains at 3,200-ish. This, we're talking 165 grain at 3,500 feet per second. It's like comparing a claw hammer to a sledgehammer. It is just 165 grain at 3,500 feet a second. Just for fun, I doubt anybody out there is actually shooting this. Maybe somebody is. Write in, please. Let me know if you own or have even shot, let alone hunted with and slain a beast with the 460 Weatherby Magnum. That's right, 460 Weatherby Magnum. A 500 grain bullet at 2650. A 350 grain bullet at 2900. You remember the 308 we talked about? Now this is apples and oranges. This is a dangerous game rifle. But just to give you an idea, the 308 150 at 2800. This is 350, more than double at 2900. What do you shoot with that? What do you kill with that thing? What do you hunt with that? Any beast that roams the earth. That we'll put in the dirt. Just some really impressive ballistics. Okay, you might think, well, why doesn't everybody shoot a Weatherby? Well, there's no free lunch, right? There's no free lunch. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. I have absolutely zero desire to fire ever a 460 Weatherby Magnum. Can that kill anything on the planet? Yeah, but so can a 375 H&H. For that matter, so can a 30-06, which is the biggest rifle that I own. And I'm saying that's right for everybody, but there is no free lunch. I am saying that. So if you're thinking like, well, if I can hunt deer with a 308 and I can hunt them with a 3378 Weatherby, why wouldn't I just do that? It's more. Well, it's also a lot more recoil. It's also a downside of the Weatherbys we haven't talked about yet. They're expensive cartridges. Even the smaller of the Weatherbys are not cheap cartridges. Now, if you reload, really you only cry the once, because you just got to get the brass. Once you get the brass, you can reload it. And yeah, the powder will cost a little bit more, but nothing like buying factory new Weatherby versus like regular factory ammunition. And it's not just buy once, cry once with Weatherby. You might cry every time you buy a box of ammo. And if you're talking about like the 3378, you might be crying every time you pull the trigger because you get the recoil. Also, there is another disadvantage in that when you push bullets to crazy high velocities, you greatly decrease the barrel life. I don't know what the barrel life is in a 3378 Weatherby, but I reckon it's going to be a lot less than a 308. Now, you might think that doesn't really matter, and I might agree that's probably the least of your worries in the Weatherbys, because you're talking about high-end hunting rifles. I mean, you're probably not going to take a tactical class and dumping, over 2,000 rounds in a week through your Weatherby. And for the kind of shooting and hunting you would do with it, probably it would last you a lifetime, maybe a couple of generations of hunting with these cartridges. Something like the 3378, I got to imagine you're not shooting too many rounds of that in a day anyway. And they're not bad cartridges, but again, there's no free lunch. For that screaming velocity and that extra foot-pounds, you get extra cost, you get extra recoil. So just some things to think about. Now, let's talk about the Weatherby rifles. Weatherby is kind of known for making fine rifles. You might think of those as like the modern American aristocrat rifles, or maybe that's just how I think of them. Maybe that's not fair. But if you're talking about the Weatherby Mark series, the Weatherby Mark V is kind of their standard rifle. And they are really, really fine rifles. They're not cheap rifles. They're not outside the realm of some other really high-end custom rifles, though. You're talking north of $2,000 to north of $4,000. Oh, as I was, there's a Mark V Hunter. Their full MSRP is $1,500, which is not cheap, but it's not as crazy as I was thinking. That is, again, not outside the realm of many other nice rifles. The one that I'm most drawn to is not their most expensive one, but it's their Backcountry Carbon. It's $32.99. And let's just say I'm not going to be adding it to cart. I don't think they're overpriced. They're just really, really good high-end rifles. And for a long time, that's what kept a lot of people out of the Weatherby game. Is they weren't going to spend that much on a hunting rifle. They either couldn't or they weren't willing to. The juice wasn't worth the squeeze. Those rifles, again, I'm not even saying they're not worth it. I think they probably are worth it. If you want a really fine rifle to hand down to children, grandchildren, something they're going to cherish, the Weatherby Mark Vs, they're just exquisite rifles. If you're like me and you generally hunt for meat and for putting meat on the table, how many deer or elk or whatever am I going to have to slay to pay for that rifle? It's just something to think about. Not that you should always think of hunting in that way. I generally think of it as a practical hunting for meat type thing, but many people don't. Many people hunt for giant racks. They hunt for the camaraderie of it, and there's nothing wrong with any of that. There's nothing wrong with it, and it's a fine rifle, the Weatherby Mark V. But for a while now, they've had a really affordable, really good Weatherby Vanguard. These are decent rifles. They are good. They're kind of known for accurate, good, affordable rifles. And these are definitely not crazy expensive rifles. Talking full MSRP, south of $1,000 for many of these. Some of them well south of $1,000. Now, you're not comparing apples to apples. The Weatherby Vanguard is not a Weatherby Mark V, but they're good rifles. And I think made in Japan, which Japan makes some really good stuff. Even the Winchester Model 70 now is, I think, either the parts are made in Japan and assembled in Portugal, I think. I may be getting that wrong, but just to say that there's some really high-end rifles coming out of Japan. The Weatherby Vanguard is a good affordable. I mean, right, you got to shoot a lot less deer to pay off that rifle if you're comparing it to like ground beef at the store. And if you want one of these screaming hot rounds, you don't have to spend several grand to get it in a Weatherby Mark V. You still can if you want, but it gives you a real affordable way to get one of these screaming hot rounds. So if that, Tim the Toolman Taylor philosophy just calls to you, like more power, like, I could have a 243, or I could grunt more power and make it a 240 Weatherby Magnum. I'm not saying that's wrong. This gives you an affordable option for that. Now, again, remember the cartridges are not going to be cheap. If you reload, that's really not much of an issue. If you don't reload, you're going to have to think about that, because look at the price of 243 versus 240 Weatherby Magnum. But it's a real option. You get a real affordable rifle option or a really fancy rifle option. It's intriguing. I was looking at the classic Weatherby cartridges, but now I skipped over the 6.5s. Now the 6.5 Creedmoor, the cartridges people love to hate, kind of. The 6.5 Creedmoor. Some people love it, some people poo-poo it, but it's a real standard round nowadays. It's one of the few rounds that have come out in the last 20 years that has really become a staple round. And real classic loading, 140 grains at 28.20. Now, I like comparing apples to apples. That was out of Cartridges of the World. However, my Cartridges of the World does not list the 6.5 Weatherby cartridges. They're either too new or just not listed. Alright, get ready for this. This is the 6.5 300. They list, granted it's not apples and oranges because this is a... Actually, you know what? I want to be fair. So let me go to Wikipedia. It'll probably have both. Wikipedia lists 143 grain ELDX real common load at 2710. It lists 140 grain at 3395. That's cooking. And there is no Wikipedia entry yet. I don't see one for the Weatherby RPM. Too new. Just came out. And it's worth pointing out that you don't just have to get a Weatherby rifle and a Weatherby cartridge if you don't want. If you want a fine Weatherby rifle, but you don't want to spend sometimes over $100 a box for ammo, then you could get a Weatherby rifle in 30-06 or 308 or whatever. So really intriguing. I guess I'll do a little short segment here about which ones intrigue me the most. I really like the Southwest, although I prefer northern Idaho. But if I were living in the Southwest, if God called me to live there and do a job or something, and I was doing quite a bit of hunting, and I wanted like a premier hunting rifle for that environment, with the kind of hunting that I do, and I like spot and stalk and still hunting, and I like doing it to max point blank range. I don't like dialing dope on scopes. I know it's the new bougie thing. I don't like having to rely on a bunch of electronics and all this and that. I like pointing at game and shooting game and putting game in my belly. I like slaying beast and eating beast. I like testing myself in the marksmanship ability, not my ability to do math and click dials and mess around with fidget spinners and things. That's just not... There's nothing wrong with that, and I like that, and I've done all manner of shooting, but if I really love spot and stalk and still hunting. So for that kind of stuff, what most intrigues me the ones that intrigue me the most, because they're not, to me, going to have prohibitive recoil, which means that I'm not going to be shy about shooting them and practicing with them. The ones that really stand out to me are the 240 Weatherby Magnum, because I like 243. And so if I'm reloading, not a whole lot of cost difference there. It would be a really good thing for antelope, pronghorn, desert muleys. Be a great round for that. What intrigues me even more is the 257 Weatherby. And I think a lot of that is just because I don't have a quarter bore. I've never had a 25-06. I've never owned a quarter bore. But they always intrigue me, and they're a really good bore diameter. The 25 calibers, 25-06 is really good as well for that size game. For kind of max point blank range, deer size game. Mule deer, pronghorn, 25-06 is awesome. And 25-06 is pretty mild recoiling. So I got to imagine the 257 Weatherby, although hotter, will still not have prohibitive recoil and would be fantastic for that kind of hunting. Those intrigue me. The 6.5's also a little bit intriguing. You get much bigger than that for me, and I'm probably just not going to want to deal with the recoil, just being honest with you. Because I want to be good with the rifle that I hunt with, which means I want to practice with it, which means that I don't want to put a bunch of rounds downrange with a 30 375 or even a 300 Weatherby. Just not my thing. But Weatherby makes some, I guess for recap, Weatherby makes some screaming fast hot rod cartridges. Sledgehammer meets laser beam. They're spicy cartridges. They make really decent, affordable line of rifles, the Weatherby Vanguard, and they make very exquisite high-end rifles, the Weatherby Mark V's. Anyway, just some thoughts about Weatherby. For those of you that are kind of intrigued, you kind of hear the Weatherby maybe talked about in hushed tones in a gun store, and you're thinking, what is up with this Weatherby? Hopefully now you better understand Weatherby cartridges, what they're about, Weatherby rifles. Get a better understanding. Anyway, with that, I appreciate you listening to Gunfighter Life. The tactical tip of the day. We talked a lot about hunting today, so let me give you a little cheap, good hunting tip. That orange or pink marking tape, it's super cheap. It's just like basically a thin ribbon. Put some of that in your hunting jacket. In fact, I just did laundry tonight and took some out of my hunting jacket. It's really good for a lot of things, marking the start of a trail. And if you are following a blood trail, or let's say you haven't found the blood trail yet, you can mark where you saw that animal get hit. Mark that spot with some of that bright tape and then walk around in concentric circles till you find a blood trail. Then if you get to a point where you follow the blood trail for a while and the blood trail starts to be hard to follow, put a little piece of that tape, the last place you saw significant blood, and then again, walk around in circles. Hopefully you find the animal, but if not, maybe pick up the blood trail again. You get the idea. That marking tape, it weighs very little. It's very affordable, and it's very handy in the field. So just a good practical, tactical tip there. Your tactical verse of the day. From Psalm 143. For to you I lift up my soul. Save me, Lord, from my enemies. I take refuge in you. Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. Comments. Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. Is that something we're doing in life? Asking God to show us His will, teach us to do His will. When Jesus was anguished in the garden, when He was having blood come out of His head, He knew what was going to happen to Him. What did He pray? He said, not my will, but your will be done. That's my Lord and my King. That's my example. Are we praying that in life, man? Are we praying not my will, but your will? Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. That's the proper relationship. We're not the God in that relationship. We're the servant in that relationship, and it behooves us to remember that. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.